to thank all of you for coming out to our What is Capitalism conference. I'd like to remind you that there is also another day of the conference tomorrow where Dr. Parenti will be giving his keynote speech. It starts tomorrow, Thursday, September 15th at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. to 11:15 is Selling Education, How Does Capitalism Change the Education System? And then we'll be having the keynote speech. And then also later that afternoon, we'll be having The Price of Beauty, What Are the Effects of Capitalism on Art? With Alex Caldiero, who is the local artist in residence, and David Knowlton, who is himself an artist and also has participated in numerous social justice events. So again, I can't stress enough, if you can make it back tomorrow, 10 a.m., this room, it should be wonderful. It will have John Goshert and Donnie Faber, who is a member of the Revolutionary Students Union. That being said, I'd like to introduce our current panel. Our panel is Investing in Poverty, Capitalism in the Developing World. And we're very lucky to have David Knowlton and Lynn here. David Knowlton received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas. He is a sociocultural anthropologist who specializes in the anthropology of Latin America with a focus on the Andes, the anthropology of Mormonism and social theory. His current interests include social organization of the transitional space of religion, the socioeconomic correlates of religious membership in Latin America, the phenomenology of Mormon life, and the relationship between neoliberalism and social movements in Bolivia. Dr. Lynn England, I'm lucky enough to know personally, as I've taken a class. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh. He specialized in Latin American studies and has done extensive research through Latin America, including both Mexico and Bolivia. He has done work on critical theory and Marxism, and if there's a Marxism class that comes up taught by Dr. England, I highly recommend it to everyone here. So this is our panel, and if you'd be so kind as to give them a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, this is kind of a free format forum, which I think is lovely, and so I'm going to take a few minutes and express some ideas, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing Lynn England speak, who's somebody who I admire enormously. It's really a privilege to be here, invited by the RSU. I have a lot of admiration for the RSU. The students who've been in my classes from the RSU have all been phenomenal students, outstanding. And so I'm excited to be here and talk to y'all. Well, as Greg said, I work in Bolivia and increasingly Peru. And the two countries are fascinating. Bolivia, for much of my lifetime, has been one of the poorest countries in the New World. It no longer is such. Haiti's decline in socioeconomic standing has dwarfed Bolivia. And Bolivia has been subject to an awful lot of neoliberalism, neoliberal reforms, which brings about the issue of investing in poverty. I just want to briefly talk about some of the transformations and some of the reasons for the transformation, the problems of neoliberalism. Of course, Bolivia has now a government that has been in place for half a decade that is resisting neoliberalism. I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the social movements that result, perhaps some of the implications, but that's a lot for very few minutes. So let me try to be schematic and move through it quickly. What are the social transformations that have been going on in Bolivia in my lifetime? When I first went to Bolivia, Bolivia is not untypical of other third world countries in terms of the social process that have been going on, or fourth world countries or lesser developed countries. At this point, each of the words has political implications, and each one is extremely problematic, and yet I'm going to use them as a catchphrase. We can talk about the politics of the implications of them. But Bolivia is typical of, it's similar to many other countries on earth. So let me talk about some of the social transformations. First of all, when I first went to Bolivia in 1974, the vast majority of the population was not Spanish speaking. They spoke an indigenous language. The vast majority of the population lived in rural communities, although it's tempting to look at the rural communities as holdovers from a pre-Columbian past with long traditions. Such would be false, as many of the historians have pointed out. Some of those communities were engaged in industrial production of wheat, for example, in the 19th century, and by the 20th century had become peasant communities self-subsistence. And so there's a history in each one of the communities that led to the middle of the 20th century, the second third, the last quarter of the 20th century, at the beginning of which most people were living in quote, indigenous communities, unquote, okay? And we're speaking indigenous languages, although that doesn't mean that people were Indian. The whole word Indian is an interesting, problematic word for a country like Bolivia. Nonetheless, people were heavily subsistence-oriented. There had been a land reform in 1953, and the initial part, immediately after the land reform, people emphasized rural agriculture, the development of local communities. By the 70s, that revolution was collapsing. Or to say it very simply, as was expressed to me by a leader in the community I worked in, a community by name of Wakuyo on Lake Titicaca. It was, we have our children, and our children will only inherit a surco of land. He was exaggerating. A surco is one furrow of land. But what he meant is there wasn't enough land for each of the children to be able to inherit, to maintain the agricultural community that had become the ideal, sort of desired ideal, by rural Bolivia by the 50s. That meant that the vast majority of children had to emigrate, had to go to the city. And in the city there was, or to Argentina, to Brazil, to Peru, some to the United States. Increasingly there was no option but for them to leave the land. And perhaps one brother would stay on the farm to try to farm, although all the brothers and sisters had interest in the land. They went to the cities, and in the cities there was very little space for them. There weren't jobs, there weren't industrial jobs. During the 70s, the whole concept of the informal sector exploded. In part, it had to do with the lack of expansion of the capitalist sector. And the ideas of the time were to talk about this population as a marginal population, but they weren't marginal. Instead, they were engaging in kind of penny capitalism. Were very involved in finding means of surviving and developing enterprises in a capitalist market through selling their labor power in any means that they could find to be able to support themselves, and finding space and niches within the cities. We're now 30 years past that, and many of these neighborhoods are now solid neighborhoods with multi-story buildings, as people have invested in property, invested in bricks and mortar, invested in their homes, and have tried very hard to put their children through education to be able to obtain professional status. And as a result of this migration, as well as the lack of development of the rural communities, so the lack of possibility, the maintenance of rural communities, we see the radical shift to where now the vast majority of the population, 2/3 of the population, speak Spanish. Most people are bilingual, but within a generation, it's likely that the Indian languages will retreat from being a majority. In the space of 30 to 40 years, will become minority languages, where they'll only be spoken as native languages by maybe 10–20% of the population, or possibly only 15% of the population. We also are in a situation where peasants' subsistence agriculture is no longer tenable. You cannot be a peasant subsistence farmer without cash these days, which means that people depend on their relatives in the city, depend on part-time migration to be able to afford the dream of a rural independent community, and it is a kind of dream. It's an ideal, a cultural ideal, but it's not a tenable one in the current market conditions. And what that means is that the urban space, the space of employment, as well as the space of migrant labor to the sugarcane fields, the commercial agriculture of northern Argentina, and the growth of massive boom of Buenos Aires, Lima, are important places whereby people find employment that can fund agriculture. At the same time, the little bit that urban people get from agriculture helps sustain the rural communities. This led to a radical transformation of life in rural communities to where national issues are suddenly extremely important on people's horizon in politics. 30 years ago, to go to a rural community was to talk about the rights of the community, the immediacy of the community. To go to a school in a rural community today is to talk about what it means to have Indian rights. So that this idea of Indian as an ethnic category, a social category, has become extremely important as an ethnicity, although it's a created ethnicity that in many ways has been created at the expense of local historical identities. It's an urban category that's occupying now a rural space. And yet the ideas of identity politics, the Indian politics, become very important. Underlying them are also extreme concerns about people's relationship to the nation state, and whether the nation state is a representative of people, or whether the nation state is primarily a representative, an administrative node in a chain of capitalism that extends from the United States or other industrial powers, or that extends from the multilateral agencies like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Fund, to Bolivia, and that determines the life course of Bolivia. Concerns are also there about environment, strong concerns about environment, natural resources, and what implications the environment and natural resource have for the possibility of local people to maintain themselves. And intermediate in those ideas are concerns about the nation state as a representative of people. And the resource of the nation state is belonging to the people, or are they private property, which belong primarily to the capitalist class for exploitation, whereby the resources then accrue to private interests, and governments make money, or populations make money based on per capita numbers, rather than actual investment in local peoples, local communities, and local benefit. These become trenchant questions. And as a result, we've seen extreme social movements, beginning with the march of Native Americans, Indians, on Bolivia in the late 90s, on La Paz in the late 90s, that shocked the country, and that led to radical transformation of politics, such that Evo Morales, who was a coca leader, syndicalist, a labor leader, became instead an Indian leader, although there's much debate about this in Bolivia. But Indian politics became where it was, not because of Bolivia per se, but it's because of the niche that Bolivian people occupy within an international space, where labor rights don't have resonance in the first world. Sorry, Mark. Labor rights don't have resonance in the first world. Indian rights do, ethnic rights do. Or as I saw a large presentation in the mall in Berlin a couple of years ago, Naturvolk, nature people, have resonance. Nature people that run around in taparrados, as they say in Spanish, loincloths, and perforate their noses with palm spines, have resonance. People with history, with complex class and ethnic histories, don't have resonance. People demanding labor rights don't have resonance. As a result of that and the local evolution within Bolivia, Indian rights has become important. It's created an ethnicity. And the same is developing right now in Peru with the new political conjuncture. So we had the March Indian rights. The next part of the march was a fight in Cochabamba between rural communities and popular neighborhoods of Cochabamba, which was called the War of Water. It was a fight against Bechtel Engineering Company and the Bolivian state. And the people prevailed and were able to fight off the privatization of the water supply. Next was the War of Gas, about Bolivia's gas reserves, and whether the gas reserves would be sold to Chile, which is Bolivia's enemy, or whether the gas reserves should be nationalized, become developed for the benefit of the local Bolivian population, rather than simply per capita benefit accruing through numbers of distributing resources over the base of the population. And believe it or not, los Travoltas, Canillas, that is to say shoeshine boys, were talking about this in terms very much like I was. They sounded like university intellectuals. This was the conversation on the streets. It was a conversation in peasant communities, a conversation in Aymara and Spanish and Quechua. This was the language. Very surprising to me. And in 2003, the popular uprising of simple people overthrew the president, the Goni, the leader of neoliberalism, and sort of reformist neoliberalism. Goni was a liberal, not in the sense of being a reformist, an attempt to bring progressivism to Bolivia, and in some ways the progressivism of capitalism, attempting to recognize things like ethnic rights, multiculturalism, to devolve power to local governments, local people, led in many ways to the development of Indian power and the rejection of the neoliberal model of the state. Right now, Bolivia has adopted a new constitution that is quite revolutionary, although as in all documents, the devil is in the details and in the realization. But the actual form of the Constitution is fascinating. First of all, it grants rights to the earth, as if it were citizenship rights to the earth. Go figure, Pachamama is now a citizen of sorts. It also recognizes the different ethnicities and grants right to people as groups, something that is untenable in much of the world, where individuals have rights, but groups don't have standing, don't have representation, unless they're represented by things like churches or labor unions, movements, so on. Here, now they have standing. And that is going to be developed in terms of indigenous organizations, indigenous communities that right now are being developed, although there are enormous tensions and complications over this that I'm not going to have time to go into. And it also recognizes progressivism of sexual rights, the LGBT thing you guys were talking about before, making Bolivia really quite progressive. Women's rights are also recognized, justified in terms of pre-Columbian understandings of gender and ethnicity, or at least the presumed pre-Columbian. But it becomes a fascinating point. This is spilled over into Peru, and not because Bolivia did it, but because there was enormous pressure within southern Peru. And over the last decade, southern Peru has seen enormous social movements whereby peasants have risen up in Puno primarily. It's Puno and Cusco like the cutting edge of revolution in Peru, along with lowland indigenous peoples. The movements have been over things like the pollution by small-scale mines of waters and pasture lands. Most recently, a rejection of a national model to take a mountain called Capia, which is considered the source of water on the Copacabana Peninsula, and sell mining rights to an international mining company. The development of major mines in the area around Chiquito, as well as other mining concessions, so that for much of the middle of the year, May and June, Puno was blockaded as local people rose up to demand that mining be banned in Puno. Can you imagine a state that lives where mining is the largest single sector of the economy, rejecting mining? And the arguments are fascinating because the militants were arguing they needed to reject mining in order to develop an economy that emphasized subsistence rural communities as an ideal and a model. This has been missed entirely in the national discourse on the movement, which thinks of the people as illogical and irrational. But they're projecting that ideal model of the rural community as a model for human development with full ethnic and rights, as opposed to a national model of capitalism whereby the state is a mediator between large capitalist enterprises and local peoples. Other movements around gas and around water, like in Cusco, the gas of Camisea, the water that is being tunneled off to the cash crops of Arequipa where you guys get your asparagus in the winter, or your onions, or your garlic. And then the other big movement is around oil in the lowlands and oil exploitation. One of the fascinating things in contemporary Peru is that the new government of Ollantaytamala recently, just within the month, passed a new law that argues that indigenous populations have the right of refusal over development of their lands. Now, the prior government, Alan Garcia, argued that the subsoil rights inhered in the state and the local people did not have right over that, hence the conflicts and the challenges. The new law grants the rights of refusal of indigenous peoples to local communities. What that's going to mean in practice, the Lord knows. But right now you have a stage set that is fascinating of popular uprising, where people are presenting other models. Now, is it capitalist or not capitalist? This is going to depend on the kinds of definitions we use of capitalism, and I fear there's often a romanticism as if they're a way of avoiding the kinds of developments we see in the world. In either case, in either model, cash, unequal relationships, relationships of proletarian capitalists, if you will, produce or the product of the market are very important. What it means, though, is a different model of how those are to be organized, and a different model of politics of how they're to be organized in terms of the state, that is really rich and presents a fascinating transformation on the global stage. I'm not a prophet, so I'm not even dare to say what's going to happen. Anyway, here's Lynn.
Just first of all, in response to Greg's introduction, I would suggest to you that after my experience with teaching a Marxism class, or actually I didn't teach it, I was present and involved with it, but anytime you have a chance to take a class with some of the Radical Student Union students, that's the class you should seek, because it automatically opens up vistas, and most of you, I think, are members of the union, but you open up the classroom to perspectives and knowledge that wouldn't otherwise take place, and you perform a major role in the teaching that goes on at this university, and I hope you, I recognize you for it, and I hope you understand it. The other comment, it's a real privilege for me to be with David. We have done research together, we visit, I've known David for a long time. In fact, David's father was a great influence on me, and a good friend for many years, and someone that I still miss. But David is sort of the surrogate for his dad in some ways. I love being with him, so this is an honor. I want to take a slightly, maybe not slightly, different approach. David has talked about his experience in Bolivia and some of the things that are going on there. I thought, and we didn't collaborate on this, but I thought I would start at sort of the opposite end of the spectrum and then work down to this question of investing in poverty. What I wanted to do was to start with the scholarship of some contemporary sociologists who are primarily European and whose focus is primarily on European society, though they treat it much more broadly than, Europe. Much of the scholarship in sociology to come out of Europe in recent years has been involved in a kind of analysis of and critique of modern capitalism. Capitalism itself has developed in particular ways, and these scholars are analyzing what has happened with, in their perspective, the world. One of the key terms that has been developed, and some of the scholars that I'm referring to would be Anthony Giddens, who has been the director of the London School of Economics, Zygmunt Bauman, who has worked and collaborated with Giddens, and then Ulrich Beck, who is a German sociologist, but who has developed similar kinds of ideas. But in the work that they do, they are some of the major developers of the notion of globalization. That is, the world has experienced this kind of growing collection of linkages that there is very little in the world that is isolated, but it is brought into the global. Giddens makes a comment in one of his analyses that in the modern world, to be local as opposed to global is inherently disabling. That the world itself is globalized, and as a consequence, the actors in the world who make a difference are part of this interconnected world. Now, for Giddens, one of the key ideas that develops here is a notion that he refers to as disembedding. And his argument is that in this globalized world, people and organizations are disembedded from their spatial and their temporal locations, so that space in particular becomes increasingly irrelevant. Those of you who work on the internet or Skype or use any of these technologies, you recognize that where you are in a certain sense is irrelevant, because you are forever now in the presence of whomever you would choose to link with. And so the fact that you sit here in Orem and your best friend is in Moscow, that distance is irrelevant. But more importantly, the fact that you have a corporation like Coca-Cola, and at one time we thought of Coca-Cola as being located in the United States, having a kind of local quality that then marketed outward. The idea of disembedding is that Coca-Cola ceases to be located any place, but is located every place. And so it is no longer something that can be identified with the United States. It's much broader than that. Interesting illustration of I think this sort of thing is, I have a photograph of Subcomandante Marcos, the leader of the Zapatista movement in Mexico, a great man who his movement flourished right at the time of the enactment of NAFTA. Was in great opposition to NAFTA. Marcos leads this movement, and he always presents him, or did always present himself with a ski mask. And my photograph has Marcos at a table about twice the length of this one. It was taken from the back of a plaza, and you can see the back of the heads of the peasants, and Marcos standing in front, speaking against global capitalism. And across the front of the table is a banner that says, "Enjoy, drink Coca-Cola." And it is this product that disembedded itself. And you can speak against global capitalism, but you can advertise Coca-Cola. And the success that is involved in this disembedding, where location and in many ways politics becomes irrelevant. The ability of a nation state to control these corporate entities has diminished substantially because they're not located anyplace. And this becomes crucial in this analysis by Giddens. Well, Bauman adds a notion that he refers to as liquid modernity, that the modern world now has ceased to be modern and has become liquid modern. And the reason for the analogy is the fluidity of relationships and of connections in the world. And in Bauman's argument, he suggests that, first of all, we have now established a world where the question is not production, the question is consumption. That we are not producers of goods, but we are consumers of goods. And who we are is created out of the goods that we consume. So that Bauman talks about the notion of an identikit. And the identikit is the fact that if I want to present myself, and I do have the sense of power, that I can present myself as I would like. If I want to present myself as a very active, physically engaged person who is a great mountain biker and skier, in order to do that, I have to be a good consumer of those commodities. I have to know what's out there. I have to know the qualities. It's not good enough that it just have the right brand name, but it is that the right brand name stands for something that operates in particular meaningful ways. Don't just buy a mountain bike, but you buy a mountain bike that has the appropriate qualities. But you also recognize, in Bauman's view, that this is continually changing, so that today's alloys and today's derailleurs, today's accessories to the mountain biking are continually improving and changing. And so you don't buy a mountain bike with the idea that you will have a relationship to that mountain bike forever. You recognize that as soon as you buy it, you've got to be prepared to shop again and buy a new mountain bike that is better than the one that you possess. But it is, in Bauman's view, a sort of frantic life. I don't just buy a computer and become attached to it. I know that as soon as I buy it, I've got to be ready to shop again and be ready to purchase the next computer. And if I have a 5-year-old laptop, I have to apologize to you because I'm out of step with the world. And so there's this frantic consumerism. Now, Bauman says, in terms of the definition of the poor, this is an interesting sort of shift, because now, see, before the poor could at least redeem themselves by going to work for low-paying jobs and being able to say, yeah, I'm poor, but I produce something. But in the consumer's world, where it's not what you produce, but what you consume, the poor are now really surplus property. They have no place because they're not participants in consumption. So consumer society, what I go about is a very rational activity of knowing what's out there to purchase and pacing myself through shopping so that I stay up to speed with what there is available, continually turning over the things that I own and then displaying the latest stuff because that tells you who I am. And those of you who know Marx well, this is a great, Marx lived a long time ago with the anticipation of this identifying yourself through things and building your identity out of things. But it's done now in this frantic, never-ending sort of pattern for Bauman. The other thing about this rationale, see, I'm a consumer. And Ulrich, this is where Ulrich Beck comes in. I'm a consumer. If I build my life around consuming, and I'm going to do this rationally, one of the things that I recognize is that I have to allocate my time very carefully. For example, see, if I spend time volunteering in a community, I'm losing time from consumption. And I could be out getting up to date on the latest alloys and mountain bikes, but if I go work on some kind of community issue, it's irrational, given that I'm a consumer. And in fact, Beck says that the rational person, if you're a woman, is the person who, Beck says for some reason, women like to have a baby. And so a rational woman is one who has one baby, so she can satisfy that. But not more than one, because if you get more than one, it interrupts your consumption. So one is okay, two are a burden, more than two are absolutely unthinkable. But now you have the one child, it satisfies part of you, and you go on consuming. If you're either male or female, in Beck's analysis, marriage is a catastrophe. Because as soon as you marry, you see the interruption to consumption. Because now you have to take into account the interest of your partner. And any time you do that to any degree, then you're not a good consumer. And so for Beck, the rational world of consumption is a world that consists of single women who are professionals, who are active consumers, who have one child, and single men who may have sired a child, but whose primary orientation is toward his own consumption. And in this process, you avoid community and connection. And there, David avoided prophecy. Their prophecy is that this will be the model for the globe, and especially for Europe and the other so-called developed countries. Well, this analysis, to me, is a sort of fascinating thing, where what they're talking about is not global society, but it is a society of consumers that is primarily located in 2 or 3 geographic areas and is built off of the poverty of the rest of the world. The only way that this kind of system can operate, the only way that you can have a Europe, is if you have an Africa and a Latin America and parts of Asia. That the things that you consume can only be made available to you if it's built on the backs of the rest of the world. So you now have this kind of process where you have a consumer space if you want to consume, you know where you go to consume. But there's the rest of the world that good consumers leave and producers are stuck there. It's the person who has to help raise the asparagus that is to be consumed in the United States and Europe. Or the person who manufactures the coffin that you will bury your loved one in the United States. But the workmanship is based on poorly paid labor in northern Mexico. And you depend on this sort of difference. But then capitalism modifies itself. See, you recognize, okay, these people on whose backs we're building the world shouldn't be completely absorbed in consuming, but they ought to be able to do some consuming. And in fact, there's a market for this sort of second-class consumer. Paul Gilroy has done some very interesting analyses of this in his work, where he talks about you develop an automobile industry that is an industry for the consumer. But then you recognize, a lot of poor people can't afford big houses, but they can afford an automobile that is designed for them. And you now begin to create automobiles that aren't quite the Audi, BMW kind of automobile that the good consumer in Europe and the United States has. But it is an automobile that both allows the poor person to express him or herself, and you market it to them. And so you now may have accessories that you attach to a cheap automobile to lower its center of gravity and paint it up and make it function in particular ways that then marks you as a poor consumer, but someone for whom you now have your automobile. And similarly for things like music, you now have them as participants, but not as full participants in the consumer society. And again, it's important that they not become full consumers. In this process, part of what you do is you need workers, but you need isolated workers. And so you see attached to globalization kind of attack on workers' organizations. That workers' organizations become disempowered. You organize in northern Mexico as a union. All the global capitalist has to do is move to China, where it's more difficult to organize. And it's partly wages, and it's partly the fact that you unionize, we'll just move out. We've done that before. We've shown, we have the model, and so you maintain this kind of category of worker who is poor, who is allowed to marginally consume, and who is always in this precarious position of you recognize if you say too much or you become too active, you're going to then end up losing your job, and it will move to Thailand or to some other place where wages are cheaper and organization is less. Well, I'll stop with that.
I guess mine is just like a comment in what you were just talking about. It's exciting to think, even though sad to see, but how you're talking as well, like how, to complain about, to want changes in your production site and job site and risking that leaving, and how the side of consumption and to consume has almost taken on then where you can have a revolution and how they use that to market. Like there's lots of, like Levi just did a commercial about, the revolution of, buy these jeans. And so even how we then think of like social change, how they market that, I think it's just, interesting. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that or.
Well, the one thing that interests me about that is this marketing of something like the notion of revolution. what is the revolution that's being marketed? No, there is this great industry in Che Guevara T-shirt, and you buy the T-shirt and you wear it and drive down the street in your BMW, and you feel like a true revolutionary because you're not part of the mold. You have broken the mold by wearing the Che shirt and having a car that many people can't afford. But my revolutionary attitude is a very narrow revolution. It is, I'm no longer going to abide by the standard norms, but boy, don't change the fact that I own the BMW. And so you get this interesting, I think, sort of marketing. It's sort of similar to what's done in the opposite direction. You market the automobile for the person who lives in the African American ghetto, that is designed to allow for the sound systems and the things that would be appealing to the poor African American, but always as a way of kind of keeping them there and not making them true revolutionaries where they'll change the system. They just go down the street annoying you because their sound system is so loud and their music is, at least for old people, so unacceptable. But don't go beyond that. And now you market it up and you say, okay, become a revolutionary, but be the revolutionary who doesn't shave. Don't be the revolutionary who goes out and blows up some capitalist establishment like a branch of the Bank of America.
I really appreciate what Lynn said because it's really fascinating and troublesome stuff. But I think there are some things that need to be added to bring some dynamism to the model. First of all, although bourgeois kids wear Che Guevara shirts and consumer revolution, there's real revolution occurring on the edges of the world. And it's the spaces where there's marginality that become interesting analytical spaces to understand the notion of revolution. And I think this is where it's very important to look at the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia right now as a place of revolution. It's not that those people aren't consuming, they're drawn into consumption, but there's a structural ambiguity there. There's the notion of the rural community, but the fact that rural people can't live in subsistence anymore. They require wages, which draws them into the system as these kind of low-income producers. At the same time, they become the low-level consumers, but they also still occupy sort of this troublesome space. It's a potential space of revolution, and indeed is where revolution is happening. The other part of dynamism is that the consumer class is not stable. It's constantly changing. And so you see downward mobility in terms of consumption, where people can no longer afford to consume at higher levels. And new classes of people do afford to consume at higher levels. Regimes of production shift, regimes of consumption shift from one area of the world to another area of the world as radical change happens. And that can make people militant as they lose their consumption ability. The part of this that is, to me, important analytically is an inequality in the world where we see capital has mobility. People do not. And organizations are, although capital can disembed itself and pretend, and I insist it's a pretense, to be not located. I mean, Coca-Cola is still incorporated in a certain place and still pays taxes and still has, is under the regulation in the United States, which is important. It hasn't completely escaped that. And so there's this tendency there, the dynamism of a thing that can look like it's disembedded as opposed to those things that are forcibly embedded. Those things that are forcibly embedded are social organization, political organization, the mobility of people. And so on many of these concepts, I turn them around into the flip side, disembedding, and the flip side of that is forced embedding. And the forced embedding limits the mobility, limits the organization, thereby allowing sort of cycles of capitalism, the movement of capitalism, to change the classes, and also brings about a kind of constraint on revolution. because it keeps the revolution in the marginal areas. And so to me, that becomes important.
And I think between the two of us, you balance what's being said by recognizing both kinds of processes taking place, and it's not a question of one or the other. It is that we live in this very complicated world where Coca-Cola is disembedded, but it may be embedded. But then the question is, Coca-Cola also has enormous power, so that it may have to abide by the corporate laws of the United States, but the fact that it is not only in the United States gives it certain powers, and then the enormous economic resources within the United States makes it so that, well, Coke isn't a good example, but the automobile industry, they bailed Chrysler out or GM out. They didn't bail me out. Yeah, damn them. But there is a very interesting complexity, important complexity to this.
Yeah, a question having to do with, especially with the indigenous rights. That's fascinating. How does, and I know you said you're not a prophet, but how will that going forward work when those societies or those economies are existing in a larger global economy? Because I imagine it's going to be, for example, there probably will be some capitalist structures, some power structures that want to, I mean, that's a threat to them.
Well, that's the Achilles heel, isn't it, of the movement? You know, how it's going to play itself out is going to be really intriguing. And, you know, as I've argued, there's a structural problem here around the rural community. That is to say that the ideal of subsistence is untenable for the vast majority of the people. Part of the complexity here is that those communities that still maintain a subsistence norm and that have an historical connection with their indigenous reality are in tension with this modern indigenous movement. Other tensions arise because the government is unable to carry out the promises around the mobilization of legal pluralism and around for example, even the simple things like the nationalization of the national product, or things like resources for the benefit of the people. Case in point is the nationalization of gas in Bolivia. Nationalization. If you compare it to the nationalizations of the 60s, ain't no such thing. It's an inversion in the rates of return, what they call it regalias in Spanish, which are in English more like excise taxes, so that instead of getting 30%, the state gets 60% of whatever the total amount is. And that becomes the nationalization. Instead of a full legal nationalization, why couldn't they do that? Because the cost of completely breaking with global society and international regulation is simply too high. But on the other hand, countries like Bolivia, despite these contradictions, and Ecuador, and to a degree Venezuela and so on, are trying to pioneer, although Venezuela is different, but they're trying to pioneer a new way of being a state in this capitalist world, and thereby a new capitalism and a new socialism that's appropriate to the contemporary period, but yet it's something that is just laden with all these contradictions. So where it's going to go, I wish I had the brain of Charles Marx, and Karl Marx, I don't have it.
Yeah, Lynn, you talked about commodity fetishism and these notions of like consumer producer. My question to you is in some cases, is it a false dichotomy simply because they're potentially overlapping? You know, producer can be a consumer in a certain context, and so I suppose my question is in regards to building a movement, where do you make that distinction? Which David sort of went into a little bit in regards to Bolivia.
Well, in the analysis, it's done by Bauman. It isn't the production stocks, of course. It's that the value placed on production and consumption shift. So that his argument is that if you were to go back to, say, the 1950s, a person could be seen as being a person of value because they worked in the steel mill. They performed a particularly significant activity within the total economy, and you could then go about presenting yourself as a steel worker and that was a source of respect. Bauman's argument is that that value has shifted so that whatever you produce, you have to do it in order to participate in consumption, but that's not the important thing about you. It is the fact that if you claim to be an outdoorsman, you know what North Face has to offer, and you know what Patagonia has to offer. And how you get your money is basically irrelevant. The important thing is you are able to present yourself through Patagonia and North Face. And you have the right emblems. But it's not just the emblem, because Nike has the emblem. It is that it's this technology that is present in North Face. And so it's again, not that production goes away, but it's the shift in what is important. Yeah. And then, let's see, the other part of your question.
In regards to building a movement, where do we make this distinction? Would it apply to somewhere like Bolivia or Peru or Mexico, which you started out your introduction?
Well, part of, I think, the challenge for this whole analysis, and I go back, say, to what I saw in the 1960s, where I was a very young man then, and going to school, I saw many of my generation who had been raised to be organizational persons, who the career and working within the bureaucracy, and there was a kind of model there, conforming yourself to the bureaucracy, and the idea was that would make you happy. But my generation looked at that and they said, God, my folks are alcoholics, they're stupid, they're attached to the television, they fight each other, they hate the world, it's not working. And thus the revolution of the 60s, where people were turned off by that sort of system that was present for the middle class. Well, I think the same thing is likely to occur here in the case of consumption. Consumption is a lot like becoming the good IBM man or woman, and being the good North Face person is also about as hollow as what was present there. And I think that at a certain point, I guess in the Marxist, it breeds its own revolution, and that we should fully anticipate that sort of thing, although I'm not a prophet either, David.
I must make apologies to people. I made a mistake. I need to leave right now, and I beg your forgiveness. It's been lovely to be here, and I would love to continue the conversation. It's fascinating. I hope you guys continue.
Let's give a round.
Again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I'd like to remind you again, I cannot stress this enough, Utah Valley University's John Gosher has a PhD and does literature. I'm sure anyone who goes to school here knows him. He's fantastic. He will be speaking tomorrow at 10 on education. I thank you all for coming, and I hope I will see you tomorrow.